Morning, welcome to our webinar, Working with Survivors in the Sex Trade. My name is Josie McPherson. I'm the Senior Director of System Advocacy here at the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. If you are having any technical difficulty, please reach out to me by email. So my email is jmcpherson, that's JMCPHERSON @NYSCASA.org. There is closed captioning available, so if you'd like to access it. Please note that this presentation is being recorded. Please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A section for questions and comments throughout the presentation, and the presenter will address them as we go. And with that, I'll hand this over to Chris Ash. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm looking in the chat right now and seeing a lot of people joining from all over. So I'm grateful for you being here today and grateful for you coming to learn how to provide that's an area where a lot of the rape crisis centers and victim advocates sometimes struggle with knowing how to balance showing up, concern for safety with autonomy and respect and person-centered services. So hopefully you'll leave today with some tips that can help you with that. And if you'll give me permission to screen share, I will go ahead and start my screen. Okay. So again, my name is Chris Ash, and I am with the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking in Los Angeles. Although I am not in Los Angeles, I'm joining you today from New Jersey, which is also not where I live. But the National Survivor Network is a program of CAST, and so we'll be sharing a little more about that in a moment. And I am the Survivor Leadership Program Manager at CAST, which means that I am primarily responsible for running the National Survivor Network, which is a professional mentoring and professional development and policy and advocacy network for peer support and engagement for survivors of human trafficking. And I will tell you a little more about myself in this first part of today's training. So a little bit about my background, and then we'll go into a little bit about history and frameworks. And I know that that seems like a weird thing to talk about first with direct services crowd, but there's a reason for that, because a lot of the norms around service provision are sort of confused because of this historical influence. We're then going to go in and talk some about voluntary service approaches and what that looks like. And when we say voluntary service approaches, we're really digging into trauma-informed, person-centered care that's empowerment focused and respects the survivor's autonomy and privacy. And then we're going to talk about some practical considerations, just some things that are important tips to know when you're working with survivors in the sex trades. So a little bit about my background. And this is not a quote from me, but throughout the presentation, I am including quotes that are from survivors of human trafficking. And that's to kind of give us context. Many of these survivors have also been sex workers at different points and have both consensual and trafficked experiences in the sex trades. And those are voices I'm really wanting to listen to and lift up, because I think they can give us a lot of insight about what service provision and policy looks like at the intersection of those experiences. So this is a quote from a survivor that says, "My experience of being in the sex worker community is that we're so stigmatized in so many spaces. The assumption is you just walk around assuming you're going to be stigmatized in a space, unless you're explicitly invited in and lovingly, with care, invited in." And that's something to remember, is whether someone's trafficked or consensual in the sex trades, there's an assumption you're going to be stigmatized or judged or looked down on and not get competent services anywhere. So this is just a reminder that we walk into this space expecting some sort of judgment. It can be very scary to go and get services. A lot of people don't go get services because they have fears around being judged or stigmatized. So I am a former sex worker, and I did end up being trafficked because I had a trafficker who was able to weaponize stigma and criminalization against me and threatened to out me if I tried to leave. So I have a special interest in this from my own lived experience, but I never engaged in the anti-trafficking movement as a client. In fact, this is a picture of me when I was probably 19. Maybe 20. And I ended up having just a mental health crisis after a period of trafficking and exploitation and harm. And I called a convent and told them that I hate my life and I think I want to be a nun. I can't handle my life anymore. I think I want to be a nun. And they're like, sweetie, that's not how this works. But do you have anywhere to spend Christmas? And so I ended up going to spend a long weekend over Christmas and ended up staying a few months. And so this is me helping decorate the convent for Christmas. And that's sort of where I did my healing and started the journey of sort of figuring out what I needed in my life. Years later, 2009, I got involved in rape crisis response. I was a hotline responder. I did hospital and court accompaniment. Non-judgmental service provision to sex workers was really easy for me. I didn't want to judge anyone. I knew what that felt like to be on the receiving end. But at the same time, I still had some not great feelings about buyers, especially during the time I was being trafficked, but even from clients during my consensual time, because that whole period of my life was a mess. There was a lot of disoriented feelings and confusion and fear and trauma happening, not just in the sex trades, but in my whole life during that time period. And when everything all around you is crisis, it's sort of hard to untangle the sources of pain. And just like with survivors of sexual abuse and sexual violence that you encounter on a day-to-day basis, the things that are associated with that really confusing time of your life, they all take on some of that energy of that harm and that fear that you carried. So I still had a lot of complicated feelings about it. So I did about 10 years at a local rape crisis center. I came on as staff and ended up supervising and training hotline responders. And I was in this place where I knew I didn't judge sex workers or sex work. And I knew that I did not want sex workers to experience discrimination or stigma. And when I heard about human trafficking, the only models that I ever heard of were just infused with a lot of shame about sex trading. There wasn't really a whole lot of balanced, non-judgmental conversation and dialogue around trafficking in the same way that there is. I mean, I know in our broader culture, there's a lot of stigma and shame around sexual violence and sexual abuse, but I know that in our rape crisis movement, we're really careful to try to be conscious of things like victim blaming and judgmental language, but I wasn't hearing that same care when I heard about anti-trafficking work. And so it was very confusing because I knew with my sexual violence framework, I really cared about things like bodily autonomy, like that's fundamental to how we understand sexual violence, right? I had real concerns as a queer person about criminalization of consensual adult sexual behavior. That was something that just didn't sit right with me because of bodily autonomy. And I also had some concerns because we all know from our anti-sexual violence work how shame can impact sexual behavior, right? We know that shame can then push you into some dark holes where you make choices that may not even, that may be not the best choices, maybe even less great choices than you would have made otherwise without that shame. So I felt when I entered the anti-trafficking movement as coalition staff, I worked at a state coalition, and I initially came on as their anti-human trafficking specialist. I felt like I was in a fun house, like when the mirrors are all weird, where they're using words I recognized, like trauma-informed and public health and survivor-centered, but that's not what they were doing, and it didn't make any sense to me. I was really struggling with how these words were being used in ways that were just similar enough to make it even more confusing that they were very different. So I started researching. I wanted to know, like, what is happening with the anti-trafficking movement? Like, how did these norms and frameworks end up being developed in a way that's so different from what I was used to in the sexual violence field? And here's another quote from a survivor of trafficking. in the sex trades. There's a very prominent savior mentality in a lot of the mainstream efforts. We're going to rescue women and girls. We're going to save them. And historically, that's been happening for a very long time. In different time periods, the language is a little different. But throughout history, anytime there's that savior framing and approach, you always then end up hearing about all the harms that the saviors are perpetrating, right? That I forget what it's called, but when there's the glow of you doing good work so it can't be challenged or rethought, you know, because you're doing something noble and good, that often then ends up hiding some of the harms that are embedded in those frameworks. So obviously we can't talk about the history of human trafficking in the US without recognizing that from the time that there were white people on this land, we had genocide and enslavement of people from native cultures. We had the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery until 1865. I tend to be less likely to use modern day slavery when I'm referring to trafficking, especially in the US, although when we start thinking globally and especially with people who are trafficked into other countries, there are models that are very similar to slavery. For the most part, I try to avoid using that language because a lot of times what we end up seeing is some of these people who have that savior mentality, and a lot of times it's white women who are using that language of modern day slavery while just talking about consensual sex work, right? And it ends up being very confusing to people and also very off-putting when we're trying to do collaborations with anti-racist organizers, given the work that they're doing, because it is different. Even trafficking today is very different from slavery in most cases. When we think about these periods in our time history, this was state sanctioned and normalized and legal. People were criminalized for trying to help you get out. There wasn't tons of government funding going to try to do anti-slavery work, right? This was normalized. You could, if you held slaves, if you had enslaved Africans, you could put them up as collateral on a bank loan. Your enslaved humans could be foreclosed on by a bank or by a government loan. Right? This is a very different model than what we see in trafficking today, right? So I try to avoid making that comparison when I'm talking in the US context, although in the global context, I do find that that language is a little more recognized. One of the things that I like to remind people is that some of our early language around sex work in this country is really about the purity, moral purity of white women. And so here's a quote, and this was a letter that was sent back to the Kilkenny Journal in 1861 in Ireland. And the quote talks about how there's some 18,000 prostitutes in New York, and goes on and says, and a lot of them are Irish immigrants. At least 12,000 of these are Irish girls. And we don't know if they mean girls or women here. They're probably referring to women. Make Irish girls stay at home, to starve and die. Let them die in their virgin purity, attended by their priests. Their deathbeds will be illuminated by the light of faith and the hope of a glorious resurrection. So we see some of the early efforts to respond in some way to people trading sex are basically like, it would be better if they died and starved in Ireland than to come here and end up in this setting. I didn't put the next picture I usually put in here into this presentation today, but there's even quotes about the purity of men, to where they start saying that because there are some of these loose women on the streets, that this is why we should never allow women out of their homes. That was another argument, to try to keep women in their homes or with chaperones, because they would tempt men, and so many men's morals have been damaged by the looseness of these women. So it really started out about moral purity. And what we start to see is it enabled a moral panic. And if you've never searched or learned much about a moral panic, that's when we have something that's a moral issue, like, right, we're concerned about the sexual purity of people, and it starts to like morph into more of a social and a political fear that gets framed as some sort of violence. And so we see that a white slave panic is what they called it. It emerged. And so if you search the white slave panic, you can find all of these documents, and they've got pictures like this. All of these are books. You can find a lot of these online, the historical documents. They're very difficult to read. They're an interesting series of books. And we end up seeing quotes in there where it was all very racist. So if you read the text of these books, you start to see things like, they are doing on the streets of whatever city it is, they are doing things. The white slave traders of today are doing things that would make the Congo slave traders of old look like good Samaritans. Right, the blackest stain on the blackest slavery ever to stain the world's history. You're seeing all of these things, and it's all got this racial coding, which played right into, like a Jim Crow kind of period, right? I'm from the South. We had Jim Crow laws. So when you start seeing those times where systemic racism and structural systems, black codes is all replacing that's what's taking the form of the racism from after the abolishment of chattel slavery. They even passed, before I get to the Freedom from Sexual Trafficking Act, they even in 1910 passed what's called the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910, better known as the Mann Act, that made it illegal to transport a woman across state lines for the purposes of sexual immorality. And on the surface, it was being named as ending forced sex work, right? Ending forced prostitution, because there was a baked in assumption that no one would ever choose to do that. But it ended up being used to go after interracial couples a lot, and to protect the purity of white women. In 1999, we have these other laws. We have the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910. We also have in 1875 an act called the Page Act that was used during a time of anti-Chinese sentiment to restrict Chinese immigration on the fears that they might engage in sex trading. But then we kind of have this lull where those were the acts that were in place until 99. And during that time, we have this convergence of this very strange alliance of very, very anti-prostitution, anti-sex work, anti-pornography radical feminists, and more evangelical conservative people who are concerned about how pornography and sex work impact moral stability of families, moral purity of people, temptations. And they come together, and this narrative starts to build that sex trafficking is modern day slavery. We have to do something about it. And to be clear, there are in fact, at that time and now, people being coerced and brutalized into engaging in the sex trades, right? We're not at all minimizing that. But this act gets proposed by Chris Smith, who's the sponsor of what became the TVPA the following year. But the first time it was proposed, it was only for sex trafficking. And during that time, they were telling Chris Smith, hey, like some labor lawyers were like, why are we talking about modern slavery and not even including forced labor and other forms of labor in this bill? Why is it only sex trafficking? And there was a big debate and a back and forth. And there's quotes online you can find from Chris Smith talking about how, this is the most brutal form of abuse and trafficking, and we need to address it first, and we'll deal with the other ones later. It went back and forth. Ultimately, this bill did not go through, but the next year, what became the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 ended up happening. And that one, they were able to bring in labor laws. But as a compromise to the anti-sex work, anti-prostitution activists behind it, they ended up encoding in language two separate definitions for labor and sex trafficking, right? Because there was a belief that the sex trafficking was inherently more brutal. One of the outcomes of that is when you hear people talk a lot about how trafficking is labor by force, fraud, or coercion. What's interesting is for both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, you can get victim services if you're able to show force, fraud, or coercion. But for prosecuting your trafficker, For sex trafficking, you can do it by force, fraud, or coercion. For labor trafficking, it's only force or coercion. You actually can't prosecute a trafficker for fraudulent labor trafficking, even though that person can get victim services. That's, again, coming back to this history of going back and forth, because businesses and the Department of Commerce, they were kind of resistant to put too many restrictions on how businesses hire. Yeah, so when you talk about sex work specifically, there's a lot of different policy approaches, and I just want to be really clear on these because people are super confused about them, and I want to make sure that we have good information. Criminalization, says some countries that we have it in. Criminalization is where there's criminal penalties for both selling or buying sexual services, right? Selling and buying. For the most part, I would say nobody in the anti-trafficking movement supports that anymore. There are some people who are grateful that that's there and have said things like, you know, I'm really glad that I got arrested. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. Or we need to be, you know, you might hear law enforcement say we need to be able to arrest the people selling sex too, because how else can we get them away from their traffickers to find out what's happening? But for the most part, the trafficking movement has recognized, especially that criminalizing victims, criminalizing potential victims, is concerning. And again, not all people in the sex trades are victims of trafficking, but even if they are, most people agree that that criminalization puts them in increased and yeah, I'm not super surprised that some of the Salvation Army groups have been supportive of it. You will not find very many survivors who are, though. And the National Survivor Network, I'll have to find a link and send it to them to share with you. We did a report a few years ago and found that the vast majority of our members were arrested during their trafficking experiences. And broadly, you then find it really hard to get straight work, right? To get housing. Partial criminalization, they have in Canada, France, Sweden, and Belize. Sometimes people call that asymmetrical criminalization. Occasionally, you will hear people trying to refer to it as the Nordic model or the equality model. It criminalizes buyers, but not those who sell sexual services. And it also includes criminalization of facilitating sex trading and brothel keeping as well. And so what this means, and this I will be very straightforward with you and say that during that time when I was first learning about trafficking and really struggling with my own trauma from having been trafficked, this was very appealing to me. It took me a while to get to where I found it a little more challenging. But what I've found is that it criminalizes facilitating and brothel keeping as well. So what that means is that this ends up getting weaponized against people who aren't really pimping, or, which by the way, most people don't. Pimping is the name of the criminal charge, pimping and pandering. A lot of the anti-trafficking movement is really pushing to recognize that the word pimp tends to have racist undertones and we try not to use it. But because that's the criminal charge, sometimes you'll hear me refer to that. A lot of times people who aren't even doing that get charged under this or are criminalized. And that could include something like, let's say that there are a few sex workers who are doing street-based stuff who are more nervous about safety. And so they set up a system by which they can screen their clients, and they're checking in with each other and sort of like have more of a centralized way of checking in and processing. Well, one of them could get charged with being a manager or facilitating prostitution. If someone ends up wanting to have a service that does that, a lot of times you'll hear people refer to those as managers if they're working for an escort service or for someone who's a manager or facilitator, because they feel like that ensures their screening, that gets them a ride where they want to go. And, you know, having someone drop you off and pick you up feels safer. It ends up criminalizing that. The other thing that sometimes gets criminalized under partial crim is that, let's say there's a few sex workers who have taken in calls, which if you've ever heard anyone say an out call is where you're going to a location of the client's choosing. An in-call is where they go to a location of your choosing, which may be your home, or some people have a place that they do in-calls. But let's say they've done in-calls and it's made it hard to maintain roommates, right? So let's say there's 3 sex workers who decide they're going to rent a place together or get a home together, so that they can have roommates who understand their lifestyle and can sort of coordinate. They could get charged with brothel keeping. So while partial criminalization does not criminalize selling of sex, it criminalizes anything related to selling of sex, which sometimes impedes sex workers' abilities to do safety planning with each other and things that help them feel like they have a little more security built in. The other thing that we have heard from people in the sex trades about partial criminalization is that it makes clients less likely to do screening. What ends up happening is, if a client is scared that he or she or they are the one that's going to get criminalized if it's a sting, and you ask to screen, which a lot of sex workers do what's called screening, where they ask to see an ID or they have some other process that they want to do, clients aren't going to want to do it. Right? They're going to be like, how do I know this isn't a sting? I'm just going to, when we're talking about street-based, if people like to do things like snap a picture of the ID and save it to the cloud just so that they have a name of someone if some kind of violence happens to them, and be like, why would I screen with you? I can just drive down the street. There's 10 more people who would go with me who don't require the screening, right? So it makes it harder for sex workers to do screening and safety. One of the things that came up during our restructure team, because the NSN convened a team of survivors to develop our recent and clarify our values statement, one of them really wanted to point out that partial criminalization ends up harming survivors too. Even in laws that have things, because it puts you in more contact with police, right? And we all know, I know that Ms. Casa did this amazing Ending Violence Without Violence series that I was able to attend as an attendee a while back. And if you were there for some of what Andrea Ritchie said, we know that there's a lot of sexual misconduct and violence by police. And so when we have increased policing of the sex trades, most survivors who were trafficked for any length of time, and many, many sex workers who are in it consensually, when you talk to them and start asking, you find out that they've been harassed, sexually assaulted, abused, raped by law enforcement. And while we know that that's not, all law enforcement, it's very, very common for law enforcement to do things like, I can arrest you, but we can make this go away if you X, Y, and Z, right? We also know that a lot of times with partial criminalization, there are massage parlor raids. I'm looking to see what's in the chat. Yes, absolutely. Exactly, especially for BIPOC and LGBTQ survivors. So they also do massage parlor raids. And I don't know if y'all have seen recently, there was something in the news, and this is very common, this comes up a lot, where in the massage parlor raids, even if there's not even evidence of trafficking, but even if there is trafficking, it's not uncommon for law enforcement during those stings operations to build evidence over time by going in and having sexual interactions with people in the massage parlors to gather evidence. And so now you have someone who may be a victim of trafficking, may not be, who ends up getting caught up in one of these raids, which are often very traumatizing for them. And now they've been assaulted how many times by the investigating officers? And now they're told, trust us, we're going to help you get services. So there's a lot about partial crim that can be problematic and very concerning. Legalization, I will say that for the most part, neither sex workers nor anti-trafficking advocates, and again, broad, there's always exceptions, nobody wants legalization. The anti-trafficking people who are opposed to sex work, anyone who's opposed to sex work does not want legalization, obviously, but most sex workers don't either. But that is where we legalize it, and the city or state government gets to set the conditions such as licensing or registration requirements. under which the exchange of sexual services can take place. In some of the places where there is legalization, what we find is you come and register, there's a licensing fee, you have to maintain your license, there may be other restrictions. And so if we think about who can afford to go pay the licensing fee and to maintain the requirements that may be set in place, who's going to be able to do that? Who is that going to help continue doing sex work legally? People who have a few $100 to drop on a licensing fee up front, right? And so if you're working outside of the scope of the legal requirements, you're still criminalized, which means that a lot of people who are engaged in survival sex and who really have the most vulnerabilities and statistical risk are still going to be unable to access, right? People with undocumented status may not be able to access this. So it's still very restrictive and puts people who already have high vulnerabilities for violence in a place where they're still going to be criminalized. If you don't have ID, if your ID doesn't match your gender presentation, that can be challenging as well. Decriminalization. So full decriminalization is the complete removal of criminal penalties related to the sex trades. It lifts penalties for both sex workers and for buyers. It does not at all affect any of the anti-trafficking laws. Under decriminalization, any commercial sexual exploitation of a minor or sex trading by force, fraud, or coercion is still 100% criminalized. And it's interesting, I noticed in the most recent call for funding or call for proposals to receive funding for enhanced multidisciplinary task forces, that the federal government finally put out a call saying that you cannot use their funding for your task force to do raids, human trafficking raids, unless you have some sort of prior evidence that there is force, fraud, or coercion happening or minors in there. So you can't just do a raid, do a sweep, arrest a whole bunch of people, and then filter out who's consensual and who might be trafficked, right? So that's just really important to keep in mind. Trafficking is still illegal. Under any of these models, trafficking is still illegal. People who are sex workers or sex worker rights activists or anti-trafficking activists who support sex worker safety often favor decriminalization. The reasons that they give for decriminalization is it then takes away the penalties. It makes it where people can screen better. It allows them to do harm reduction and safety worker organizing amongst themselves. The reason that a lot of times they will say they prefer decrim instead of legalization is because even if we made sex work legal today, there's still centuries of stigma built up, right? We're still not going to have that stigma go away. A lot of times people have lost their children because of their sex work history. Sometimes even if they were trafficked, people have lost their children because someone found out they had been engaged in the sex trades while they were being trafficked. People who oppose sex work and pornography and do anti-trafficking work from that lens tend to oppose decriminalization as well, because they say that they are concerned that the ability for people to buy sexual services is what's creating a market that facilitates trafficking within that form of labor. I myself am kind of concerned about that framing, because for me, like Whole Foods creates the market that facilitates labor trafficking, and we tend to look at worker rights and worker organizing and labor laws as the solution to that. So for me, with adults especially, this labor framing tends to make more sense to me. But I wanted y'all to understand the differences, whatever one of these you feel like is appropriate and makes the most sense to you. I at least wanted you to understand the differences between them, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So one of the things that I noticed in the trafficking movement is that there is a criminal justice prevention emphasis. They are very reliant on the criminal legal system. One of the thing that I've realized is that like when you think about our anti-sexual violence work, we know what sexual violence is, and then we advocate for laws that better capture what sexual violence is. So sexual violence is a form of violence, and we have tried to have legal responses that align with our understanding, but there's plenty of forms of sexual violence that are not criminalized, right? With human trafficking, because it was created looking at that history by people who were not survivors or impacted, I think human trafficking is more of a criminal definition that encompasses the intersections of a lot of other forms of violence. I don't know that human trafficking itself is one form of violence, because when you think about it, trafficking could be a young child who's being commercially sexually exploited. Trafficking could be a 16-year-old who's homeless and trading sex to survive. Trafficking could be a 16-year-old who leaves a party with somebody and one night trades sex for money. Trafficking could be a person who's held, of any age, who's held in bondage for a period of time and repeatedly and often exploited. Trafficking could be someone who is working in an agricultural, as a farm worker, and was offered this work under one set of conditions and finds out that now the conditions are different and they aren't getting breaks. Like, it's so many different things. I really think of trafficking more as like a legal definition that encompasses a lot of different intersecting forms of violence with an economic exploitation piece, like an economic abuse piece. In the trafficking movement, coercive interventions are really normalized. Typically, we put the blame, especially with sex trafficking, we put the blame on someone being in the sex trades, right? To me, a lot of times just going after the sex trade sounds a whole lot like slut shaming. And in our anti-sexual violence framework, if we have a survivor who we encounter who was engaging in a whole lot of sex, we don't think that that in some ways justifies what happened to that survivor, or that we should tell them they shouldn't be engaging in a lot of sex anymore, right? We have this non-judgmental service approach. In the trafficking movement, there's a lot of times blame is put on consensual sexual behavior. There's some exceptionalism, and what I mean by that is, to me, sex trafficking, it's a form of sexual violence, right? Like, y'all, if you are anti-sexual violence service providers and experts, you're the experts on sexual violence. And what I find a lot of times is the trafficking movement treats it as if it's very different. I've even had people who I met when I first started in the anti-trafficking movement who said that letting the survivor choose what they want to do thing may work for you sexual violence people, but with trafficking, it's different, right? So there's this assumption that it's exceptionalized or different. The other thing that happens in the trafficking movement is survivors' stories are shaped for them. A lot of times survivors who are in the trafficking movement who do policy work or public speaking, when you really start to have conversations with them, they tell you they were given talking points, or you start to hear that they were scared to say the wrong thing because they were afraid of losing income and opportunities to speak. And this is really problematic, right? Because how can we actually listen to what survivors need and are telling us if we're too busy telling them how to reframe their stories? So the sexual assault and DV movements, I've seen there's a public health prevention emphasis, right? We tend to think about how, like, we know criminal legal systems are about crime prevention, and public health tends to be more about violence prevention, right? We have an emphasis on survivor empowerment and autonomy. It would be wild for us to envision engaging an adult survivor of sexual violence in a coercive program, coercive shelter, coercive services. We have a firm dialogue around avoiding victim blaming. We have, instead of this exceptionalism, we have a shared risk and protective factors and strategies. Our framework looks at how these risk and protective factors can make all forms of violence more common. And so we reduce those risk factors and increase protective factors. And then we also, survivors shape their own stories. Y'all all know that when you hear someone sharing their story, that they're telling you what it is for them, how it happened, what they need. That story of that survivor may change over time as that survivor has time to process what happened to them and to heal, and also maybe to learn more about power dynamics and structural violence and systemic norms that perpetuate violence, right? What has happened because of this exceptionalism is these things then end up impacting funding, norms and frameworks, and policy. And this is a loop, right? So the norms and frameworks in the movement then impact the policy that we create, and the policy then impacts the funding. And then the funding continues to impact the norms and frameworks. What we've seen in this work is that as some of these pools of money that fund anti-sexual violence and anti-domestic violence work start to also apply and include human trafficking, we're seeing sexual assault and DV centers taking on anti-trafficking work, which they should be, because y'all are the experts on any human trafficking that involves sexual abuse or partner violence, right? And by the way, any form of trafficking can involve sexual abuse. Sexual abuse and sexual assault of trafficking survivors in other forms of labor is rampant, especially among women and girls. So we cannot have this neat division that sex trafficking is the only one that involves sexual abuse. So y'all are the experts. But what happens is when I did TA as a coalition staff person, I was getting calls from rape crisis centers who were saying things to me like, so we were trying to do like a really survivor-centered empowerment approach, and some local human trafficking orgs reached out and told us we were doing it wrong, that it has to be a different approach with human trafficking survivors. What do I do? What we see is that the more that we start engaging in this human trafficking work, instead of seeing SA and DV orgs really bring that breadth of wisdom and experience and decades-long history of providing really survivor-centered services, what we're seeing is they end up starting to adopt some of the human trafficking movement's norms when they're engaging with survivors who may be trafficked. And a lot of times, because some of the human trafficking movement's norms involves conflating consensual and trafficked sex work, or consensual sex work and trafficked sex trading, because of this conflation, we start to see them start to apply these human trafficking movement norms to all survivors in the sex trades, even those who say and are clearly in it consensually, right? And that's kind of scary, because what ends up happening is sex workers don't want to go get your services anymore. I'm hearing from sex worker organizing groups that have stopped referring their clients who experience sexual violence to the local rape crisis centers, and are instead creating really brilliant and wonderful mutual aid and peer listening projects to try to provide that support. But come on, like, it breaks my heart to think that there's someone who's scared to come to a rape crisis center because of having these norms forced on them, especially when we think about how strongly sex workers may fear coercive intervention, such as diversion courts or a criminal justice system involvement, criminal legal involvement, right? These are all very scary things for them to consider, especially when you look at impacts on things like child custody and housing and ability to find straight work or to maintain, a non-sex trading job. And this is a quote from another one of our survivors who had worked in movement work at an LGBTQ center. A lot of survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault have stopped going to their local rape crisis or DV program. Our LGBTQ housing program has stopped referring sex working clients to the local center because they automatically filter anyone in the sex trades to their human trafficking case manager, and it's just not what they're needing or asking for. So I want to talk a little bit about a voluntary service approach. And I know for those of us in rape crisis language, this is sort of a weird thing to say because everything we try to do is voluntary service. But in the human trafficking movement, there's a lot of training on what does a voluntary service approach look like, because it's not really normalized in the trafficking movement. And so here's another quote. It's the rare occasion that I've seen it play out where they've been mandated to services because of law enforcement interventions, that they've been able to form a really healthy relationship with an organization and the service providers there. What I've seen more is that oftentimes some of the problematic or coercive dynamics that someone's experiencing in exploitative sex trade involvement or trafficking can get played out within the service provider provision. Right? So we end up seeing situations where you have someone who's been told, I'll take care of you, I'll house you, you have to do what I want or else you have consequences, and they're being trafficked. And then they end up getting mandated to services where they're told you have to do what I want and I'll take care of you and you have to follow these steps, and you end up in this like, I just want to meet your requirements so you won't harm me. I want to just meet your requirements so you won't send me back to jail. I want to meet your requirements so you won't kick me out. So trauma-informed and healing-centered services, voluntary service approaches need to be trauma-informed and healing-centered. So you want to support survivor autonomy and choices, large and small, and always follow the survivor's lead. You're going to want to acknowledge and celebrate the survivor's strength and resilience, right? And these are all things that you already do for rape crisis survivors who come into your doors. I'm telling you, do them for your trafficking victims as well. Acknowledge and celebrate the survivor's strength and resilience. Have any of you ever worked with a client or a survivor that you're working with and noted you did what you had to do to survive? You were so creative and resilient in taking care of yourself in the best ways you could, right? Acknowledge that. The choices you made make a lot of sense. If you've never seen Full Frame Initiative, they have a well-being planning toolkit that's sort of their alternative to a safety planning toolkit, and it looks at the fact that people are making trade-offs, right? You made a trade-off that, given the choices you had before, you made a whole lot of sense, right? You're showing that they have strength and resilience. You want to avoid strict program requirements that create barriers to healing. You're going to want to non-judgmentally account for personal trauma as well as intergenerational, cultural, and historical trauma, and protect survivor privacy and confidentiality. And that's really important. That is something to where with adults, I am strongly opposed to any kind of mandated reporting of trafficking. There's a lot of places where, because of that history of exceptionalism we've talked about, people are trying to get automatic mandated reporting for adults who they believe are being trafficked in place, and that's pretty scary. That's going to be a barrier that's going to keep people from coming to you. I want you to think about the fact that trafficking takes away a survivor's autonomy. The person's human rights are violated through exploitation of labor and restriction of their agency and autonomy and ability to consent or refuse. We are not going to be able to undo the harms that trafficking created in someone's life by restricting their agency and autonomy and ability to consent or refuse. We're just replicating the patterns of traffickers when we do that. You have someone who's not had their choices respected ever, probably ever in their lives because of prior trauma. A lot of survivors of trafficking will tell you that's not even the worst thing that ever happened to us, right? So many points in our lives where we couldn't make our own choices, or no one listened to us, or we weren't able to self-direct, and now you're being mandated to services that are for your own good, that people are telling you is going to help you, where your choices aren't being respected. It just doesn't make any sense, right? It can be really harmful. One of the questions we get when we talk about a voluntary service approach is, how effective is it? And what people mean by that is, will it get someone who's being trafficked out, right? But I want to break down how effective is it. And then like, what do we mean by effective? I don't know. It depends on how we define success, right? And what do we mean by success? The trafficking movement typically has defined success as immediate exit or rescue. Please don't ever say rescue. Rescue and restore. Restore, I've heard survivors say, what am I, old furniture? Restore, a lot of times survivors will say, restore to what? Like, my whole life has been trauma. I have an ACE score of 9. What is the pre-existing before you think you're restoring me to, right? So rescue, restore, those words can just die. So what do we mean by success? I think by success for me, we're thinking about rebuilding the survivor's trust, autonomy, and consent, just like with your other rape crisis clients, right? Helping them establish trust and autonomy and consent and trust themselves again, right? And how do we stay focused on the long-term outcomes? Because again, voluntary service approach, someone may dip in and out. Someone may come in and get services and they're in a situation where you suspect they might be trafficked, but they're able to come in and ask for help, which again, someone who is unable entirely to ask for help, the investigators hopefully are able to identify some of what's happening. But I'm talking about someone comes into your organization, they're describing a situation to you that is clearly trafficking, and they are wanting to talk about a sexual violence situation that they've experienced recently. And you recognize what's happening, but we're not going to make their choices for them. We're going to talk them through options, right? They may leave and not come out, just like with DV. Have any of you ever worked with a DV client who stayed in a situation for a really long time? And again, it can be heartbreaking as a crisis responder to hear that someone's in an unsafe situation. But a lot of times, if we remember, there's 2 things. One, what are their options? Sometimes it may be safer for them to stay in there for now until they have some other things in place, right? What if the trafficker is also the other parent of their children, right? And they know that they're then going to be dealing with custody issues. And the other thing is, sometimes we just have to remember trans-theoretical stages of change, right? We have those models wherein we don't really just act the moment it crosses our mind. We need to build some time to think about it. There may be some denial, and then there may be a point where we recognize what's happening, but we're not ready. Be aware that there may be some time. You're not going to always have the immediate exit that you want, but the reality is, if that person trusts you, they're going to keep coming back to you for support, and you're going to have an opportunity to build the kind of trust with the client, and also to help them build the kind of trust with themselves to make the choices that are best for their life. I say this a lot, and I've started putting it in trainings. Becoming a more competent organization for survivors of human trafficking should not make your organization less competent for people in the sex trades broadly. Right? If the things that you do to try to get that trafficking money and serve those trafficking survivors cause you to harm survivors in the sex trades, sex workers, they do experience a lot of sexual violence, right? Especially from police, and a lot of it's created by criminalization and stigma, and it makes it hard for them to come forward. We want to serve those survivors too, right? So we need to be thinking, how do we serve all of them? How do we create protocols that allow us to support anyone who's experienced sexual violence, whether it's outside of the sex trades altogether, in the context of some form of trafficking, or in the context of consensual or survival sex work? And here's another quote from a survivor of trafficking in the sex trades. People vote. They vote with their feet. In my experience, many of the mainstream anti-trafficking organizations will collaborate and work with law enforcement, and clients can be mandated to their services. To me, it's pretty telling when, after that mandated period is done, people stop going back. To me, that says actually their needs are not being met there more times than not. So I'm going to do just some practical considerations, and then we may have some time for Q&A. But I think we have a poll, and I would love, I don't know if I can launch the poll. There we go. So our questions are, have you ever worked with rape crisis clients who had been assaulted while engaging in criminalized or illegal activity? Sorry for my typo there. Have you ever worked with rape crisis clients whose sexual choices were very different from your own? And have you ever worked with rape crisis clients? Boy, saying rape crisis clients over and over. I'm stumbling over my own tongue. Have you ever worked with rape crisis clients who made what you believed was not the best decision? And we'll give y'all a little bit of time to respond to these. Maybe a little bit longer. Again, have you worked with clients who had been assaulted while engaging in criminalized or illegal activity? That could be anything from, you know, drug sales, underage drinking. Have you worked with clients whose sexual choices were very different from your own? And have you ever worked with a client who made a decision that wasn't a decision you think you would have made if you were the one making the choice? All right. And we can maybe share results and see what we've got here.
Should be able to see the poll results.
Yeah, I was looking at the poll results. There we go. So it looks like the vast majority of you have worked with someone who had been assaulted while engaging in a criminalized or illegal activity. Almost all of you have worked with rape crisis clients whose sexual choices were different from your own. And a good number, 70% of you have worked with rape crisis clients who made what you believed was not the best decision. I know 10 years on, I did 10 years on a hotline, y'all. I think I might have mentioned that at the beginning. I did 10 years on a hotline. Thank you. I did 10 years on a hotline, and I remember having a client once who was describing, it was an adult who was describing some physical symptoms, some medical symptoms that were very concerning to me. And, you know, we sort of did the crisis stabilizing thing. They were in a safe place now. They kept going back to these symptoms. And I said, I'm kind of concerned about your health. Have you considered going to the hospital? And she said, no, I can't do that. I just can't. I can't. And I'm like, okay. And so we kept talking and processing a little more. And again, you know, when she would mention it again, I would say, you know, I did loop back around. I'm kind of concerned about your health and safety right now. I mean, what you're describing sounds like a thing. Like, have you, you know, I know you said you didn't really want to do the hospital, but I'd just love to let you know, like, I'm concerned, right? So, but I didn't get to make her go to the hospital. I even ended up offering to meet her at the hospital myself. Would it help it be less scary if I met you there? And she said yes. And so I went to go meet her at the hospital. She never showed up, and she didn't answer my call when I tried to call back. I had feelings. That was hard, right? As a human, that was scary, right? That was hard for me. And I just want to remind us, some of these situations where we're worried about someone, or where they were assaulted, if you've ever worked with an underage student who was assaulted at a college party, and how they tend to want to blame themselves because they were drinking, right? And also because of cultural messaging about DFSA. We have the skills already to work with clients who are in these situations, right? So here's another quote from a survivor. When folks are met where they're at and they get to say, here's what I need, their involvement might be more sporadic in organizations than if they were mandated, but they keep coming back when a need arises, which to me signals, oh, they know this is a supportive place to go, and that they will get the support they need, and that there won't be judgments about it, right? That's what my goal is as an advocate. So I want to name the spectrum of agency. And a lot of times you'll hear this called the 3 C's, choice, circumstance, and coercion, right? So people's options and choices about what kinds of work they do are largely influenced by circumstances, and agency is not always straightforward. And we hear people talk a lot about the spectrum of agency in sex work. I read a really cool article by Joel Quirk, who's an anti-trafficking expert who writes for the Beyond Trafficking and Slavery project of Open Democracy. And he named that we kind of have this spectrum in all forms of labor, right? If you think about in the US, there's probably not a whole lot of people who could just like leave their job if it was harmful to them. There's a lot of people doing work. Like if we think about it, I would leave this work if I had better options. That might look like I do work that is really hard for me and hard on my body. I do work that has big impacts on my physical health or medical health because it's the industry that's most accessible in my area. Or I do this work that is emotionally traumatizing for me because I can't make this much money in other spaces. Or I do this work that I don't necessarily love and that maybe is in contradiction to my ethical values because I have a disability. I'm disabled, and it's the other jobs just aren't accessible to the hours I'm able to work and what I can physically do, right? So most of the US is doing work that's circumstance based. It's very, it's a place of privilege to be like, I have so many options and I freely choose to do the work that I'm doing right now. I love my job. I'm doing it by choice. I could have done anything else and this is what I'm doing. I am in that position in my life right now, but I didn't get into that position until I was in my 40s. That was a rough a rough lead up of doing a lot of different work options that were really hard and traumatic for me. Work by force, fraud, or coercion is human trafficking, right? A lot of times what we see with the sex trades and in some of the anti-trafficking narratives you'll hear is they're like, 85% of people in the sex trades would leave their jobs if they had better options. Therefore, we should treat it all as trafficking. But the reality is, economically, under our economic systems, that's where most people doing most labor fall, right? Anyway, I present this to you because it suggests different solutions, right? If we're trying to help someone to not have to be in, they're not being trafficked, they're doing it by circumstance. They're not enthusiastic choice, not being trafficked. They're in that middle ground of, I would leave it if I had better options. How do we help them leave it? By ensuring that there's better options available. So I just point this out that a lot of people you'll be engaging with maybe in that circumstance section in the middle. Many of the survivors in the sex trades are going to need access. And when I say survivors and people in the sex trades, I mean trafficked, consensual across the whole spectrum. There's sex work, there's trafficking, and a lot of sex workers are in that circumstance area, right? So survivors who are engaging in the sex trades in any form may want or need access to many of the same services your other survivors need, such as safety planning, case management, housing, legal services, or counseling. Requiring exit from the sex trades as a condition for services is a barrier for both sex workers and trafficking victims and can erode trust with your organization. Be non-judgmental when working with survivors in the sex trades and ask them directly about their goals and needs going forward. Every survivor's goals might be different from each other. We can't make assumptions that every person in the sex trade has a goal of exit. Some of them may not. But even if there's someone who's in it consensually and their goal is exit, then let's think about how we can help that person build themselves up and have other options. Are there organizations in your community that have non-judgmental economic empowerment supports, right? Are there scholarships for childcare that maybe you could connect them to? And then work with the survivors collaboratively to decide what services will be best for them, because that helps build agency and autonomy. So there's a big dialogue in trafficking. A lot of that criminal legal framing of it has led to this big thing on screening. We are screening to identify whether or not this person has experienced trafficking. it's really tricky because for a lot of trafficking related services, you have to be certified as a survivor of trafficking by a lawyer or some sort of service provider. Therefore, they need to use these screening tools to identify it. To me, as someone coming out of rape crisis, that was bonkers that you have to get certified as a survivor in order to get, like we don't spend time on the phone trying to determine whether or not someone's a survivor of sexual violence before we provide them competent care. There's a push to move more towards needs assessment. I don't know that the law has caught up, but if you do screening, who is screening for? Screening isn't for that person, that survivor. Screening's for you to determine, screening that doesn't serve them. Needs assessment does. Needs assessment is a way of letting them know, I care about you and want to meet your needs. I am less concerned with putting a label on your experience than I am with finding out what you need and how I can support you in having that need met. There's a tool called the PAIR tool, PEARR, the PAIR tool created by Heal Trafficking. And it's a model, instead of being a model to screen someone for whatever form of violence it is, it's a model that helps you create the conditions for disclosure. How do you create the conditions in which someone can feel safe disclosing whatever it is they want to disclose to you? It's not coercive. We're not doing the screening tool. We're not asking them a bunch of questions so we can check our boxes, which makes them feel like someone's science project sometimes. So you want to provide privacy, make sure they're in a private, safe space. There aren't people around. The other people with them are not in the room. You want to educate them. Educate is where you might say something like, oh, so I'm hearing what you're describing and what some people in similar situations have described as this thing that we call, if you're hearing like red flags for trafficking, right? You can say, some people in the sex trades who have been through similar situations as yours, not all, but some of them end up realizing that what they experienced is trafficking, and that is where human trafficking is, where someone's being forced to do sex work who doesn't want to, maybe by violence that they're experiencing or physical abuse. They might be coerced, where someone's threatening them or people they love, or threatening to take their kids away if they try to leave. Or coercion, which is where someone's maybe, or fraud, which is where someone tells you the conditions will be one thing and they trick you into doing it. Is that familiar? That's where the ask. Is that maybe something you've experienced? And then no matter what they say, whether it's yeah or no, or I'm not sure, the two R's are respect and respond. You respect their answer, you don't pry, you don't put your judgment over it, and then you respond accordingly. So if the person has disclosed something that sounds like trafficking, you move from there to figure out how to meet their needs. And if someone doesn't, then you end up responding from there and trying to figure out how to meet their needs. Then let's say you think someone has experienced trafficking, you can then ask, right? If we need to certify them with an official screening in order to get them access to trafficking services and funding, well, after doing a needs assessment, you can say, based on what you're telling me, you may qualify for some services that I know of, but they require me to do a screening to see if you qualify. Is it okay if I ask you some questions now based off this checklist? Because at that point, when the survivor hears it, what they're hearing is, I want to help you meet your needs, and these questions will help get us there, which helps them understand where that's coming from, and just instead of feeling like I'm getting grilled, right? I don't know if y'all have ever been in the situation where you're on the receiving end of some clinician or whatever's checklist, and you're like, they're not even making eye contact with me. So the PAIR tool is wonderful. A lot of people have advocated in the anti-trafficking movement, especially those who oppose sex work, have said, well, why don't we just broaden the definition of trafficking to include more sex workers? Why don't we call it all trafficking so they can get services? But what ends up happening is then that ends up justifying more policy and protocols that are harmful to people who are in the sex trades consensually. And they end up doing that, including trying to do that with trafficking prevention and with response. Like, how can we broaden it and just treat it all like trafficking? But that ends up causing harm to people who are in the sex trades consensually. And as people who are really focused on survivor-centered care and autonomy and bodily autonomy, we want to be really thoughtful about how we engage with that dialogue. A lot of survivors who I talked to who've also been consensual sex workers have said that your language you use really makes a difference. And so there's a push, especially among anti-trafficking orgs that have an anti-sex work or anti-pornography lens, to apply the language of victimhood to all people in the sex trade. So they tell them don't ever say sex worker. Right. And to be clear, a lot of trafficking survivors, especially if all they ever experienced was being trafficked, saying that they're sex workers can be really problematic. They're like, I'm not, right? Like that was not what I did. I was assaulted. Like, I don't want to call it sex work. But then we end up having some anti-trafficking orgs go completely in the opposite pendulum direction and referring to anyone in the sex trades as prostituted people or prostituted women, like whether or not they were trafficked. Or instead of saying sex work, they'll call all sex trading commercial sexual exploitation. Even as adults, even with adults, they'll be like, you're experiencing commercial, we've served survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. And you realize when you talk to them more that they're referring to people who've been in the sex trades consensually too. What ends up happening is that alienates a lot of people who are in the sex trades consensually and call themselves sex workers. They then don't want to go. They're like, I'm not a prostituted person. I'm paying my bills, right? I'm doing what I gotta do. And I've even heard some people post memes that kind of joke and are like, are you a social worked woman? Which made me laugh because there's a lot of social worked people on this call today, right? So think about how that language feels and how it takes away your agency, right? It takes away your agency and your ability to acknowledge that you've had choices. So just think about the fact that some sex workers have also experienced labor trafficking in their lives. Some sex workers have also experienced sex trafficking in their lives, but not all have. Some sex worker rights activists may be sex workers, labor trafficking survivors, or sex trafficking survivors. Like, these are not discrete categories, and we don't want to conflate them all because, again, not all sex workers are trafficking survivors. But we want to be thoughtful that people's identities and how they understand them can be really different. And there are people doing anti-trafficking work in the anti-trafficking movement who are also sex worker rights activists, which blows a lot of people's minds because these are presented as if they're so divided. But a lot of the sex worker rights activists who I've started to get to know a little bit better, I find out they're trafficking survivors. They're like, yeah, that's why I advocate for harm reduction. And you just don't hear that narrative. So be aware that people's identities are complex, and you've got to respect that in the language that you use when you're engaging with them, or else you're going to alienate them. So we're going to do a word activity. And so your choices, if we think about people in the sex trades, whenever I say people in the sex trades, I am referring to current or former sex workers, current or former trafficking victims or survivors, and people who have both of those experiences. Because there can be current sex workers who are former trafficking victims. There can be current trafficking victims who are former sex workers, right? We can have both of these. And we're going to have a word come up, and in the chat, you're going to put whether you would apply, who would you apply this to, or is this a word you would never use, or only if reflecting back how they self-describe. And there's not a right or wrong answer, right? I just want you thinking about how the people impacted might experience the language. So prostituted person. Is there a situation in which you would use that language? We'll see if there's anything in the chat. Yeah, so we have, there you go, only if self-described, correct, right? So we're seeing things only reflecting. I normally wouldn't if they asked for that, right? If someone talks about being a prostituted person and you come back and say, so when you were a sex worker, right? That you might lose them, right? We want to be gentle with people's language. It's the same thing what you would do with any other survivor, right? You're going to reflect back the language they use unless it's something you need to shape. So commercial sexual exploitation. Where would you use that word? Yeah. Y'all can kind of feel out only if, yeah, okay. So all of these are things where you can feel out what feels right for you with your values and all. I would not ever use that word to refer to current or former sex workers. And because a lot of the anti-trafficking movement has used that word to sort of like weaponize it against sex work broadly, a lot of times I use it when I'm referring, I only lead with it or use it if I'm referring to children or minors, right? Yeah. So be thinking about it. And I'm seeing some of it in federal grants, right? When we write the grants, we use the words they want. So the point isn't necessarily that you have to make your right or wrong decision. It's that you want to be thoughtful about when and where you use it. Sex worker. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And this is something that's really tricky because you will find that a lot of trafficking survivors, especially if that's all they experience was trafficking, really don't want that word at all. And are like, you should never use it to refer to someone who's been trafficked or in a trafficking experience. But we see a lot of sex workers who are like, hey, we say someone was a trafficked farm worker. You know what I mean? Someone who experiences trafficking in other forms. Like, be conscious that while I don't use it to refer to anyone as trafficking victims or anyone who's a trafficking victim or survivor, that part of that's got a baked in assumption that sex work is different from other forms of labor. But I am really on the side of using it, not using it for the trafficking victims or survivors unless they refer to that, being trafficked in sex work, just because that can be a hot issue. So we're going to think about needs. Think about the services that you offer and that you help connect people to. And again, we're going to do the same thing with some of their needs. So trauma-informed medical care. Mm-hmm. Yeah, everybody needs trauma-informed medical care, right? So this is a place, and if you ever hear me, when people hear me talk about how by people in the sex trades, that's the language I use to refer to everyone. So you can say, if you're ever doing a partnership with local medical doctors or a training for medical professionals, you can say, people in the sex trades across the spectrum of agency need trauma-informed care, right? That's a shared need. Legal advocacy. Yeah, everybody needs it. Probably both. They might need it for different things, right? You may see both. Yeah. So that's another shared need that y'all are able to help connect people to. Non-judgmental support. Yeah, all of them. So this is something where I think a lot of times rape crisis centers and people who maybe don't work, confidentiality. Who needs confidentiality and privacy? It can be really tempting because of that exceptionalism in the language we hear, to be like, we've got to figure out if they're a trafficking survivor so we can give them different services. But a lot of their needs are shared, right? And this is where having that framework of people in the sex trades across the spectrum of consent need certain things that are shared. There's a lot of shared needs. Vacature and expungement, which for those that aren't familiar, vacature is where we reverse any criminal convictions related to an experience that you've had. Expungement is where we get rid of the record of it. Potentially both, right? They might need help with that. It might be harder to get vacature and expungement for sex workers than it is for trafficking survivors. Yeah, so that's a shared need. Access to non-carceral options. Who might need that? Yeah. And again, anyone across the spectrum. And we do that a lot with survivors, like, right? At least when I did survivor work, if someone said, I do want to report this, and I do want to engage with law enforcement, and I do want to see my trafficker prosecuted, then we talked them through what to expect and what that would look like and supported them through that process. And if they said, I explicitly do not want engagement with these systems, I do not want to report, then we supported them in that choice, right? These are things that everybody needs. When I did TA for rape crisis centers about how to support human trafficking survivors, the thing I found myself saying more than anything else is, well, how would you do it if it were any other client? We hear that a lot. We're like, detox, and I'm going to repeat gendered language because that's what we hear a lot, right? I end up hearing rape crisis survivors that are like, these girls, or rape crisis centers who are like, these girls end up coming to us and they need detox. Like they have an opioid addiction because their trafficker made them do it. They need this detox, and how, we just aren't equipped to do that. And it's like, well, maybe that's because you're not doing a good job of serving people with marginalized experiences and communities in the first place, right? If you don't have options to help a survivor with detox, that's a bigger issue than whether or not you can serve trafficking survivors. What would you do if you had a DV survivor come to your shelter who needed detox? Because it's not just trafficking survivors who need it. Well, I'm worried about their trafficker. What if their trafficker comes here? You think a trafficker is the only abusive partner who has access to weapons and the ability to cause harm and be scary? I mean, if you've worked with partners, with sexual violence survivors whose partners, some of them are scary. I sat in a hospital with a sexual violence survivor once while we did safety planning so that while her gang-involved boyfriend was tracking her on the phone because he made her share the location. She wasn't being trafficked, but that was scary, and that was just a sexual violence client, right? So how would you do this with anyone else? And here's another quote from a survivor of trafficking in the sex trades. Regardless of someone's lived experience, there's just the reality for many of us, internalized shame and stigma around sex trade involvement. And I have grave concerns about what it means if someone is carrying that internalized shame about sex trafficking, and they show up to an organization where that is further messaged. That results in real harm, soul level harm that comes with judgments and being in spaces where those conversations are happening. We've got to find ways to talk about this without contributing to shame and stigma for people in the sex trades across the spectrum of consent, trafficked or consensual. The reality is a lot of people are carrying internalized shame about their lived experiences. I threw my email up here. If you want to email me, you can. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to see if there's any questions. Let me see what we have here.
We actually haven't had any questions come through, but lots of folks who are appreciating, the level of detail and nuance that you've shared, as well as, the importance of focusing on the needs of people in the sex trades across the spectrum of agency.
Thank you. Let's see if there's any other questions. All right, well, y'all reach out if you have any questions, and I know Ms. Casa is also wanting to support y'all in continuing to think through how we're providing competent services for people in the sex trades across the spectrum of consent. Super important. Thank you for being here with us.
This was great. Thank you so much, Chris.